All right, there we go.
Okay.
So, welcome everybody to the SoCal PowerShell user group. My name is Matt Bobke, and this is Mike Kanakos. He's from the RTPSUG user group, and he is a PowerShell developer, but he likes to call himself a sysadmin. Go figure. And he's going to talk to us about Azure DevOps tonight.
Hey, everybody. Thank you for having me. Matt, thanks so much for giving me the opportunity to run my mouth for about an hour. Hopefully, I won't put you guys to sleep. Thank you, everyone, for joining me tonight. As Matt said, my name is Mike Kanakis, and we're going to be talking about Azure DevOps services tonight. This is sort of an intro to Azure DevOps. And it's funny that we were just talking about the sysadmin thing, because this is going to be sort of from a sysadmin sort of focus. We're going to be featuring sort of the on-prem aspect that you can do with Azure DevOps. And why is that? Well, it's because it just doesn't really get known to a lot of people that you can do some on-prem stuff with it. So I thought it'd be kind of cool to talk about that. We'll definitely go through everything that's involved with Azure DevOps and kick the tires on everything. But a little disclaimer, if you work in an environment where your environment is a true DevOps environment, this may feel a little odd to you because I probably am going to seem like I'm going against the grain for how Azure DevOps wants to work. And that's okay. We're going to talk about that in a second. I'm basically going to be presenting here an alternate way that you could use Azure DevOps in your environment. So with that being said, let's get started here. No slides tonight. I just have one long markdown document of stuff that I want to talk about. And please let me make a few things noted. This is not super polished demo. This is me sort of doing some stuff on the fly. I have pre-planned a bunch of stuff, but I can tell you not everything always works as planned. It's okay if we have mistakes. I'm okay with that. I hope that shows you some real world scenarios. And if I happen to be going through some stuff here that might be going a little too quick, or I just sort of botch the explanation, please feel free to jump in and ask a question. I would be more than happy to answer any questions I have. And the last thing I'll say is I use Azure DevOps in my daytime job. I would consider myself to be pretty good at the interface, but there's always room to improve. So if someone on the call has a better way to do things, please feel free to share that with the others. This is real world experience and learned from what I've figured out over the last few months of working with the service. Doesn't mean that it's the best way. But with that being said, why don't we get started? So tonight, I'm going to run through a quick agenda here of the meeting. We're going to talk about what is Azure DevOps and what does it do. Now, oh, we got a hand up here. Hey, Stephen, how can I help you? Stephen, did you have a question that you wanted to ask? You have your hand up. That's okay. It's okay. We won't hold it against you. But if you, there you go. All right. So take two. We're gonna be talking tonight about Azure DevOps, what it is and what it and what does it do. Now that may seem obvious to some people. Azure DevOps, right? Maybe the name sort of tells what it is, but I think that there's going to be some people tonight that are going to be surprised at what Azure DevOps can possibly do and the way that I'm going to use it. So we're going to talk about sort of the ins and outs of how Azure DevOps works. I'm going to try to highlight why you want to consider using Azure DevOps as an on-prem, as an automation engine in your environment. And there's no great mystery here. The combination of cost, features, and flexibility makes it a pretty strong candidate to consider. And then I just talked about it a little while ago, but I'd like to really focus on how you can run some on-prem workloads from in the Azure cloud and why you might want to do that. We'll go through the interface. I'll show you how to get started. We're going to tweak the knobs and the buttons and show you the different features that are there and different choices you can make. I have some automation that I've set up. We can create new ones. We'll run that automation and hopefully that'll generate a lot of questions. We'll have a good conversation. If you are not familiar with who I am, my name is Mike Kanakis. As Matt alluded to, I'm a Microsoft MVP, but I also work for Invisalign during the day. I'm a senior infrastructure tools engineer, and I spend most of my time in Azure AD, Active Directory, and doing a single sign-on. I write a lot of PowerShell tools and scripts for other teams, and our team, my team, and myself, we use Azure DevOps as our automation engine in our own environment. So living with the tools that I'm talking with about tonight. If you'd like to follow me online, you can find me on Twitter. I do a lot of community stuff and I share a lot of stuff. I also have a website. And if you have a question, feel free to email me or reach out to me on Twitter. So with that being said, let's talk about why Azure DevOps. And the best way to do that is to, hey, Mark, if you are listening, Mark Weiss, could you shut off your camera, please? We would appreciate that. What choices do you have today in your environment? Thank you, sir. What choices do you have today, right? If you're working with standard out-of-the-box OS, Windows or Linux, you basically have two choices, right? You have the task scheduler and you have cron jobs, right? Of course, there's third-party tools. We'll talk about those in a second, but you know, when it comes to tools that are included in the OS that you have today, scheduled tasks and scheduled jobs, which ironically did not make it into PowerShell 6 and 7, are pretty robust. We've gotten by pretty far with the task scheduler. Cron jobs can do quite a bit in Linux, but both of them can leave you with some fits, make you scratch some heads, and deal with the sort of clunky interface of both tools. That leaves room for third-party tools to come in and do a better job, stuff that people are probably familiar with, like Jenkins and Ansible, Octopus Deploy, and others, right? And those exist simply to make a better environment for us, right? However, what a lot of people don't understand or may not consider is that Azure DevOps can absolutely be your automation platform of choice, regardless of the interface of the language that you're using. Azure DevOps is a very affordable solution for any size business, and I do not want to make this sound like a sales pitch because I am not here to tell you that Microsoft is the be-all and end-all, but I will tell you that you can absolutely run Azure DevOps for free, and yes, I do mean that, for free. And I'm not talking about, well, you can run this for like a month and then you run out of free credits and then you have to pay. No, you can actually absolutely run this tool for free in your environment, and I'll show you that in a second. But as I said, Azure DevOps, whether it be because of the name or because it lives in the Azure cloud, a lot of people don't think of it as an on-prem solution, but one of the great things is it can manage the cloud or on-prem, and we'll talk about that in just a little bit. And I'm sorry if I'm running through a bunch of basics here. I'm assuming that not everybody has seen Azure DevOps, so I really want to highlight some of the basics about the tools so that you understand where we're at. Probably the single greatest strength of Azure DevOps today is that it's software as a service, which means Microsoft maintains the environment. It's automation in the cloud, and that means you don't have to do anything. You show up with your scripts and some parameters, you plug them into the tool, and you're off and going. You don't have to patch, you don't have to update, you don't have to upgrade, you don't have to build more boxes when you need more capacity. All that is done for you. Microsoft maintains it. It is an enterprise grade service, which means it has a very high level of reliability, probably somewhere around 98 or 98% uptime. And that makes it very easy. You log into an interface and you just do what you got to do and you move on. And if you happen to live in the Azure cloud already, whether it be through Microsoft 365 or Azure AD, well, those pieces basically plug right into Azure DevOps. So you start with a service and you're basically email enabled. And if you want to leverage groups from your Azure AD environment, you can do that, or roles that you already have configured. The engine that runs Azure DevOps can handle pretty much any language. It's a PowerShell group. We'll be talking PowerShell tonight, but that's not limited. You can run Bash, Python, C#, F#, Rust, C, anything you could think of, JavaScript, HTML. If you can think of a language, most likely Azure DevOps can run it, and it can also run multiple languages within a job. So There's lots of choices, but what I like to say is if we simplify them down to just the basics, Azure DevOps becomes a really easy service to use. Last but not least, we're going to be working in the GUI tonight. You can work GUI or you can work command line based. There is a learning curve to getting up to speed on the command line. That's why I'm going to be working in the GUI tonight. The GUI is pretty feature rich. You can do most of the things that you need to do. The command line lets you do more, but you need to be familiar with topics like YAML. And maybe that's not a good place for someone to start, especially if you're a sysadmin, a software admin, a desktop admin, software deployment admin, help desk person that's given some extra rights to run some automation in an environment. Those kinds of roles probably don't lend themselves to YAML and DevOps and cloud roles. So that's why we're going to keep this as simple as possible and show you what you can do with it. So with that being said, let's take a look at a diagram here. This is how Azure DevOps looks from a conceptual point of view. So it's a service that runs in the Azure cloud. And that service, as you would imagine, can reach out to other Azure services and manage them, right? So I can manage my Azure environment with Azure DevOps. But if I have the environment configured and I have connections to alternate clouds, I can use Azure DevOps to reach out to AWS or GCP and run automation in those clouds. I'm sorry, guys. Am I not sharing? Let's start this again. How about now?
There you go.
Guys, I am so sorry. You know what happened? I did a demo beforehand and then I shut it off. So just a quick
No
recap.
worries.
All right. So here's a diagram. This is what I was just talking about. The stuff before was just bullet points. I'll go through them again if anybody needs a recap, but so sorry for that. So the Azure cloud is configured as you see here. It's a service that runs in the Azure cloud, and it has the ability to manage miscellaneous Azure services. And as I was saying, but without the use of a diagram, and now we do have a diagram here, you can reach out to alternate clouds. If your environment is so configured to reach out and touch those clouds, you can run automation in those other clouds with Azure DevOps. But one thing, as I said a couple times already, that is probably lesser well known about Azure DevOps is it's a cloud service, but the cloud service can absolutely reach out to your local network and manage on-premises services. This box here is red because this box is going to basically function as a gateway for Azure DevOps to come in through an agent. And then once on-prem, you can run your on-prem scripts and manage your on-prem environment. And that's kind of where we're going to focus our time with tonight. But before we do that, we need to kick the tires on what is Azure DevOps, all the services involved. So let's get a walkthrough on that. All right. So if you've never seen Azure DevOps before, I will take you there in 1 second. But to get there, you would go to dev.azure.com. And if you already have an account, it would be / your account name. If you don't, you go to dev.azure.com, you sign up, you create an account, and then that will be your login link. When you get there, the first thing you're going to do is you're going to create a project. A project is a collection of settings that you store everything about your automation in. You can have multiple projects. Projects can have different rights restrictions and access levels, all kinds of stuff. But within a project consists the services that make up Azure DevOps. And that's these 5 services that you see here right now. Let's see if so we're talking about these guys here, right? And these 5 services, when you look at them, if you have a sysadmin background like I did, I'm a director of services engineer now, but I cut my teeth as a sysadmin doing server, Active Directory, client services, help desk, right? So I'm thinking about workstations and servers and application deployment, right? When I see boards and test plans and artifacts, that feels very not sysadmin and feels very DevOps, right? And when I say very DevOps, I say not the way that I probably work in an infrastructure role. And I kind of want to put that notion to bed here because these are the services that are included, but you don't necessarily need to use them. So if we go back here and we look at these services, and I'll run through them here real quick. Boards, is basically what it sounds like. It's a planning module that allows you to have Kanban boards. You can post issues and have people respond to them and have milestones and things like that. Repos is where you store your code. People probably understand that. Pipeline is the engine that's going to execute your code for you. Test plans are going to be if you want to verify that a bunch of things are good before we execute code, a la DevOps, i.e., I write code, I release code, I test code, and when my code passes tests, I then run code. That's what test plans are designed for, to test your code in various scenarios that you've developed to make sure that it's going to work as expected. And last but not least, we have this thing called artifacts. And artifacts is a way to store software in the cloud. Now, I'm not saying that we're going to store Microsoft Office and we're going to install Office, but instead we can create feeds that we can pull software from when we need to. So for my PowerShell family, the best description I could use to describe what artifacts is if you create your own modules and you need to park them somewhere, well, your first choice is the PowerShell gallery, but that's a public repo. Maybe you don't want to have your stuff public. You could make a private repo. Today, you can make a private repo on any of your Windows boxes, but that takes configuration and you are responsible for a box. And if you need to run stuff in the cloud, how do you get your cloud resources to reach back to your private repo that's on-prem? Well, that's really what artifacts is for. It's a place to store code like a private module, make that streamable via repository like a NuGet feed or others, depending on what you're doing, NPM and others. You can host packages of Python out there, for example. And what that'll do is that'll allow you to store your module in a private repo if you prefer, or public. And then when you need to pull that module for your automation, it's available. And if you need to run it from your on-prem stuff, it could also be available. So that's what artifacts is about. But, you know, if we go through this for a second here, and if we're worried about things being a little confusing, you know, if I want to run automation on-prem, I probably don't need boards and I probably don't need test plans. Now, I'm not saying that testing isn't necessary, worthwhile, or necessary. What I'm saying is most of the times for admins that are running code on site, they've developed a script, they've tested the script, now they simply want an engine to run the script, okay? You could even go so far as maybe you don't need artifacts. Okay, so if we scratch those three off, what are we left with? Well, now we have a service that runs repos and pipelines, and that seems a lot more like what I'm used to. I need a place to store my code, and I need a way to run my code. Now, these features here are valuable and can be used depending on your environment. But if they're not for you, that's what these toggle switches are here. You can turn them off. So my first recommendation is when you're getting started with Azure DevOps Services, especially if you're going to be looking at an on-prem configuration, keep it simple. Stick to the stuff you need. You can turn on the others later. It'll just make the interface that much easier to understand. So and we're going to do that in a second here. Right? But the idea here is that what seems like a DevOps-oriented service, cloud-oriented, probably meant to run big stuff, can very easily be turned into a service that is very much similar to cron jobs, Task Scheduler, and these third-party tools that we use to schedule automation with just a few little config changes. So the thing to take away here is that Azure DevOps can really grow to any size environment that you need. But if you want to get your feet wet with it, you can start with very basic setup, right? And we're going to get to lab and demos here in just a little bit, so just bear with me. I just want to give you a little bit more of like feeder information to give you an idea here. So I want to talk a little bit about the cost of Azure DevOps, because I think a lot of people think that things that run in the cloud have to be expensive, and that is certainly not the case with Azure DevOps. You can run this for free. It is surprisingly cheap even when you do incur some cost. And you can take a look at that with the calculator, and I'm going to show you that right now, just to give you some real-world examples. So that link that I clicked on takes you to AzureMicrosoft.com pricing calculator. And when you come here, on the left-hand side, there's going to be a section here called DevOps. And when you click that, this is super not intuitive because you're like, wow, what the heck is going on here? Nothing. Well, you just got to scroll down. And here is your estimate page to give you an idea of what it's going to cost. So if we walk through the different pieces here, I'm going to show you why you can do this absolutely for free. So Azure DevOps has a number of different scenarios like configured, and you can see the prices can get pretty pricey, right? But don't let those numbers scare you away here. We're going to walk through this, all right? So this is a licensed product. You do need a license, but when you set up your account and you set up a credit card with Microsoft, you basically are given a license. It's called a basic plan. And the basic plan includes the stuff that's on the screen here. The agile piece I talked about, version control, continuous integration, which is a fancy word for running scripts all the time, right? Some other stuff here. There's no charge for editing work. That's nice of them to let us actually use the tool for free, right? I'm being a little facetious here. But the thing is, the truth is, the first 5 users that are going to interact with your Azure DevOps environment, and I'm talking about admins who go in and configure the tool, are free, right? So we go through this tool here. You can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 is free. Hey, I need a 6th user. It's $6 a month, right? This is not a bank breaker here. If I need 10 users a month, well, again, the first 5 are free. We're talking about a $30 a month cost, okay? But I would argue that most people probably don't have 100 people in their scheduling engine for automation. It's probably a small select group of people. Maybe not the case, but in small shops, that's definitely the case, right? So if I'm staying at 5 users or less, I'm incurring no charges. All right. So what does that get me? We're gonna skip this here because this is for the test plans, right? If I want to use test plans, I need a license for that, and you can see it's $52 a month. Not terrible, but obviously not free. But I had argued about 10 minutes ago that maybe you don't need test plans. And if that's the case and you don't need test plans, well, then we don't need a license for that, right? So now we get down to what you can actually do with the tool. And in here, they have different tiers, and we're going to look at the free tier because the free tier will get you pretty much everything you need, at least to get started, and for sure to be able to get a fairly good amount of automation running. So with the licensing comes 2 pipelines, a hosted pipeline and a self-hosted pipeline. And I think you probably know where I'm going with this. This is going to be a pipeline that runs automation that's targeted to the cloud, right? So that's going to be jobs that run here, that hit here and here and here, right? That's that. But my self-hosted pipeline is for when I want to run Azure DevOps jobs from here and go down to here, right? So now if we look at that and we see what's included, in my cloud pipeline, I can run 1 job and I can run up to 30 hours a month, again, for free. So now, jobs, if you're running 1 job that runs for an hour, this may not be for you. But if you're running simple scripts that are going to run 10 minutes, 5 minutes, 2 minutes, you absolutely can get away with this. Now you might say, well, what am I going to do with 1 parallel job, right? Let's look at this one for a second here. All organizations include 1 self-hosted parallel job with unlimited minutes. That means if you're running it on-prem, there's 0 cost. The only limitation here is you have 1 pipeline, 1 parallel job. And what does that mean? That means if I have 2 jobs that want to kick off at 3 p.m. in the afternoon, 1 job is going to run, the other is going to wait until the first one runs, and when the first one finishes, the second job will start. It means you can have 1 job running at a time. You can queue up as many jobs as you want, but only 1 job will run at a time. Well, maybe you need to have more than 1 job run at a time. It's $15. Not the worst thing in the world. Maybe you need to be able to run 5 jobs at a time. That's $60 a month. But let's think about this. If you're still at 5 users and you're not running test plans and you probably don't have a need for a big use case in the cloud, right? And you want to run a bunch of jobs on site, well, this is still a $600 cost per year. That's probably cheaper than any third-party solution that's available. for running automation, unless you're doing an open source solution, right? So let's just take this away. If I'm running one job using the free services, unlimited minutes with 5 users or less, my cost is 0. And that has no limit. There's no time bomb that's going to end in 6 months or a year. So this is why I say it's a fantastic service if you need to run automation and you need a modern service, right? We didn't mention artifacts, but if you do want to use artifacts to store code, well, you can store up to 2 gig of artifacts for free. After that, it's $2 a gig. So here I am. I'm at 10 gig. I'm at a pipeline. I'm at 10 users. What's my cost? How did this get up to front? 10 users. Oh, I hit the test plan one. Sorry. 10 users. My cost, $61 for the month. So you see, this can be pretty cost effective if you need to run automation and you need something modern. And the reason I say modern is we're going to jump into the interface now, and hopefully you'll feel like there's a lot more choices than the task scheduler, right? So I hope that's a pretty good overview of the cost. I didn't want to spend too much time on it, but it really is sort of the unknown. And this makes for an easy sell to your boss, your manager, or to a finance department. Hey, I need $20 a month to run automation on our environment. So I would consider you to strongly, I'd like to ask you to consider strongly thinking about using the solution, and we'll get into the nuts and bolts of it now, right? So probably a good point to stop here and just see if anybody's got a question. I don't have the chat open, so I should probably take a look at that. AD is not Active Directory. Looks great. Mark, what do you mean by AD is not Active Directory? All right, we'll come back to that. All right, so I just want to give you a quick run through of what we're going to be using tonight. Very simple setup. I am running a Hyper-V Lab. It's Active Directory. Is it Active Directory or Azure DevOps? Active Directory is the directory services that you run in your on-prem environment. Azure DevOps is the automation service that runs in the cloud. Azure Active Directory is Microsoft's identity solution for third-party access to various web services.
I think he might have been referring to a diagram that was on the screen.
Oh, did I make a typo? If I did, I apologize.
The AD and the triangle in the picture.
Yeah, this is Active Directory. It's just to say that most people have Active Directory environment. It's not a requirement, right? But if you use Active Directory, you know, this will plug right into that. I'm sorry if that was confusing. This was done about an hour ago, so I'll work on that. Okay, so I'm going to be running an Hyper-V environment. I'm running just 2 machines. I have a DC and I have a build box, right? So in that diagram, this red square is this AZ Build 01. And then I have a DC that's going to serve 2 functions. I need to do some DNS, and we're going to reach out to that box later on with a command. So that's our big environment here. And then we could start jumping into some stuff. So your first steps with Azure DevOps is you're going to go to the website, and this is the process of getting from 0 to 100. You need to set up an account. You need to make a project. You don't have to, but I recommend you turn off what you need, what you don't need. You don't have to set up a repo. You can manually copy your code in, but I recommend you do that as well. Commit any code you want to your repo, configure a job, configure an agent pool, which I'll talk about in a second, and then you can start running jobs. Now, I think the interface is pretty good, and I'm going to show you that in 1 second. It's probably a little confusing to someone who hasn't seen it before because there's a lot of places to configure things, but I do think with an hour or 2, you can get pretty comfortable with the interface and you can be running jobs the same day they set it up. And I'll show you how to do all that. So let's go check out the interface here for a second. All right. I am here, Azure DevOps. I have two accounts set up right now. These are my organizations. So I'm going to be working in the mKanakis organization right now. And in the mKanakis organization, I have 2 projects. You can see from the icons here, these are the services that are running in the project. So we talked about skinning down the services that we need to run stuff. This one is just a test project I spun up just to see what it looked like. It's got everything on by default. Here's one I configured with only 2 services. So this is what we're going to use tonight. All right. So when you would come here, you would set up your account. You would come into this interface and you would say new project. New project is just a wizard, give it a name, public or private, create, and that's it. Right. So if I go test 2, private, create. This is a deployment, take about 30, 45 seconds, and you'll get a project. So here's my project. If I go back up to the top, I now have a new project here. And the order here is just most recently used. So once I start using this one, it'll move back over to there. But getting started with Azure DevOps, because it's software as a service, is just sign up, create a project, and then we're off to the races, right? So I'm waiting for this to catch up to me, and I'm just going to do myself a favor and move this off to another screen so I can follow along and make sure I remember what I wanted to tell you guys here. So you may or may not see this look that you see right now when you start up your project. What you may see instead is this. And I do believe that sometimes that this is the default, and it can be a little confusing because you don't really see some stuff that you need to see right off the bat. So the first thing that I want to point out to everybody is that there's a gear down here, and there's this pop out. And the reason I say that is because it's very easy to miss this option here. Remember, this thing that I'm in here is called a project, and this is the settings for the project. We then have settings we can set for repos and pipelines and other stuff. But first thing I want to do is I want to go to project settings. And I'm just going to keep the chat open every now and then. Okay, cool. So I can change some stuff here, right? This is all down the left here. I have a bunch of things that I can configure, right? So I talked about the overview, right? Here's where I can shut off the things that I'm not interested in using. I can turn them back on. I can turn them back off. Cancel, remove boards. Okay. Right. It's that simple interface, right? If I want to delete my project, I click that button. It'll ask me to type in the name of the project, and it's gone. Right. Permissions are pretty self-explanatory. If you're Azure AD enabled, you can pick up these groups and you can use them. These are the default that are in here. I haven't configured any of these. If you're playing around with Azure DevOps and Azure AD for the first time and you configure an account in the Azure cloud, you'll be made a global admin if that's the only account you have, and global admin will have access to use Azure DevOps, so you won't have to configure any permissions. But if you did want to configure permissions, you can set up permissions here, right? Notifications is email alerts, right? And you can do quite a bit here. And let me just show you real quick. I've been playing around with this all day. Show my. I have the defaults set on in this demo vault, this demo project, which means I'm getting a lot of alerts. So you can configure alerting to run on fail, success, anytime you make any changes. There's quite a bit that you can see in here. You can see it's been a busy day for me, right? So the alerting is really good. I can tell you how we used it. So here's an alert and it tells you the details of what happened, tells me commits, tells me a pretty good amount of information, and it gives me a link that would take me straight to the job, right? So I can kind of get a good feel for what happened from just an alert. Okay, underneath settings, you can set how long you want to keep your data. That's really logs and run information about previous runs, right? This is all the default info. You can change it if you want. The thing that you're probably going to change here is agent pools. So agent pools, by default, you'll have these two here. You'll have one actually, excuse me. You'll have this default, which is Azure Pipelines. I had added one playing around with some stuff. This one I added, right? So let me go back here for 1 second. This is when you configure a job, one of the things you're going to set up in the job is which pool do you want it to run against? And in a pool, you pool resources that you want to use to execute this work. So if it was Azure Pipelines, you're telling it, go out to the Azure cloud. Microsoft's going to take over from there and say, all right, we'll handle resource load and balancing out the load for you. But if I go to on-prem here, like I built this one here, I can set up agents. So I can have more than one server that can run a job. Now, I told you one is included, right? That's why this one is offline. You can buy extra agents. So this is how you would load balance. So AZ Builder 1 is running a job. Someone kicks off another job. It's going to see that DCO1 is idle. It'll send the job there and it'll run it that way. But this is one agent I have running in here. And if I go back to agent pools for a second, adding a pool is really pretty simple. Self-hosted, give it a name, and then you have to just download the link to get the agent configured. But it's a really easy interface to use once you kind of get a feel for it, right? So downloading an agent is pretty simple. There's a website that you can look for Azure Pipeline agents. Down here, it gives you tips on self-hosting, on Microsoft hosted agents. And if you go down here, you'll see different agents that can be downloaded. I went to the Windows agent. There's a page on how to configure the Windows agent. I'm going to tell you that it's super simple. You download a zip and you run the command. There's a command file that's in there. You run the command, and it's going to prompt you with a window that I'm going to show you in 1 second. So let's talk about security for a second. How does what do I want to do? How does Azure DevOps get the ability to talk to your local network? Or more importantly, how does your local network get the ability to log into Azure DevOps to say, hey, I'm an agent, you can come and talk to me? Well, there's a couple of ways you can do that, but probably the way that is the easiest is a personal access token. So on your account, you can set up personal access tokens, and it's a very easy process. I can go here. I forgot already how to do it. It's that one. Personal access tokens. And you'll come here and you can create a new token. So what's a token? It's a fancy way to say it's a really long password, right? So you give it a friendly name that you want to use, configure permissions, and it's pretty extensive. As you see here, show all scopes. There's 28 more levels that you can set permissions for. When you hit create, it'll generate a random password that's about 60 characters long. That's your personal access token. You need to secure that. Once you say create, once it goes off the screen, you won't be able to see it again. The only thing you can do is regenerate it, I think. Yeah, there's no way to see more. There's no way to see the password or the token again. So you need a personal access token, and you're going to use that token when you configure the agent that you're going to install on your machine. And I'm going to show you that now. I've already installed the agent. I would do it with you, but it's dead simple. I'm going to just show you a screenshot of what's involved. For group permission, you need Azure AD P1. Permission. Hey, Diego, I'm not sure if that is true because I'm in a demo account here and I don't have any. I do have an MVP subscription that has extra rights, but I'm not using that. I'm using my pay as go account and it's just a standard account and I'm working. So for group permissions, I'm not 100% sure. You may be right about that. And I'm sorry I can't answer that in detail. I'm just not sure. All right, so going back here for a second, we're going to work on configuring this piece. And the reason I'm going to show you a screenshot is because I was starting to say it's really simple. You download a zip file, you unzip the file. Let's see if I still have it on the machine. I might even have it on the machine. Let's take a look here. Okay, here's the zip file. And when you expand it, here's what you get. Right? And you're basically going to run this command here. And when you see they've done the work, but it's pretty straightforward, you run that and that will pop up a configuration window that looks like this here. And the reason I'm not running this, actually, I'm sorry, it's config. I'll show you that one again real quick. That was at the root. Agents, config. Same thing, not a lot to it, right? They do the work for you, so you're just going to run this file, and when you run it, it's going to come up with this config window here. And the reason I said that we don't need to do this is because there's a total of 7 things that you can configure here. I've highlighted them in yellow, but you're going to see it's pretty straightforward. What's the server URL? In other words, where does the server go to? So that's our Azure DevOps link, right? So this is the same link as my account here. So I'm just copying and pasting that into the window when I'm prompted. Everything here is stuff that I entered, right? So it's going to say enter the server URL. I'll put this link in. It's going to say enter a personal access token. I'll paste in that personal access token that I generated. It's going to connect to the server, meaning it's going to connect out to Azure Cloud and register. It's going to say enter agent pool that I want to join. So on-prem, this is going to go back to here. If we go to, let me go get out of here. Azure DevOps. I went back a little far. Project settings, agent pools. Remember I called my agent pool on-prem? Well, that's what I'm entering here. What's the name of the pool you want this server to join to, right? Enter a work folder that you want to do the work on the machine. I just said enter. Enter, do you want it to run as a service? I said yes. User account you want to use for the service. Enter for the default, and you're done. That's the config. So once you have this running, what you'll have now is you'll have a service. I keep going to the wrong box. You'll have a service on the box called where's my Azure Pipelines Agent, and you can see it's running as network service. And rights, we'll talk about rights in a second, but I've just configured my server to phone home to the Azure environment and get access into my account to be able to grab automation, pull it down and run it on the box. So once you've done this step, you're pretty much ready to start, right? We said here, set up an account, make a project, set up a repo, come out, right? Configure an agent pool. So we didn't talk about the repo and the jobs yet. We'll do that now. But with a few steps, you're ready to start configuring jobs, right? So let's take a look at that for a second. All right, so if we jump on this box, if we jump back over here, let's go back in and look at, so let me just talk about repos for a second. So I think in this world now that most people are familiar with GitHub, but if you're not, you don't need to be like super put off, because this repo here lives in the cloud. If you're familiar with GitHub, you're just going to say clone. You copy this here. You come down to your machine. You do a git clone and that commandlet, and you now have the repo on your machine. And to show you that, just to give you a little idea here, this is a VM. right? It's the VM in my environment. But down here, I have VS Code running on my actual machine. And if I go here, you can see here that this is a demo repo that I have for the actual demo. But then I have is the repo, right? So AD user report, right? So I have that synced up. It's just regular Git. I do a Git clone onto my machine. It doesn't have to be the demo of the build box. You don't need to keep code on that. And then I can work in VS Code or the ISC or some other script utility that you use to build scripts, and you can push them up to Azure DevOps. You also don't have to do this at all. You can actually work right here in the repo, and you can create files right here. I don't particularly like that because it's not the easiest to work with. This is what the interface looks like. It doesn't really have a lot of like the features that VS Code has, like tab completion and figuring out bracket pairs or anything. But if you needed to, you could work right here. All right. So with that, why don't we look at so set up a repo. Okay, so we talked about a repo real quick, right? And you could see in this repo, I have some code that I put up here. These are commits. This is all my history of pushing up here, right? And you could see jobs failed and succeeded, right? This is all stuff that I did, right? Branches, I'm not using any branches for this here, right? All the stuff that's associated with Git. In pipelines, this is where I configure jobs to run. Now, first things first, it always defaults to recent. So this is not all the jobs. This is just the most recent ones. If I look at all the jobs, here's a history, and you can see here with a simple interface, this last one was a success. This one didn't go so well, right? This one has not been run yet. So pretty easy to understand. If we want to create a new pipeline, which pipeline, fancy word for job, it's right over here, new pipeline. Okay, and we're going to go into that for a second. Actually, let me do that and show you what it looks like. So, you know what? I don't want to do that yet. Let's go back and look at an existing one. Right. And I can run this and show you how it works. Okay, so when I pull this up, what I see here is my history. And you can see a lot of this has failed because I'm just playing around with stuff, right? Branches, I get analytics. It tells me how good things have been going. I'm obviously a pretty crappy coder. I got a 14% success rate on my jobs, but we're not here to judge, right? This is my job. And if I want to edit it, I just click the edit button. And what I get is this interface here that allows me to configure a job or edit an existing job. And there's a number of different pieces here. And this can get a little confusing. So we're going to take some time and go through this. I'll just come back here. P1 is required for Azure AD groups used in role assignments. If you want to use private identity management, you need a P2 license. Thank you, Greg. So this is the interface, and it consists of tasks, variables, triggers, and others. We're going to work here in the task section, and I want to point out this library section. We're going to use the library in a little bit. But what we have is when we create a job, it starts with a pipeline. Okay, you name that pipeline. This is the job name that's going to show up in this list. Whoops, in this list back here, right? And then you have the option to select here the agent pool, and I suggest you do set it here. It's a drop down, and this is the agent pools that you configured back in that project settings area where we said pools. So on-prem will only show up after you've created it, obviously. Okay, now when I select on-prem, Azure DevOps, this job is not concerned about the resources in on-prem. What this says is when I run this job, reach out to the on-prem pool. So that's why right now I just see a pool name. I don't really see information about the pool. I don't really care, right? And then as we go down here, the next thing you need is you need to get your code, right? So that's going to be a source. I'm going to show you how to do this in a second. And this is saying we want to use our Azure repo. However, maybe you don't want to use this repo. You don't have to. If you're already out in the GitHub cloud, you can use GitHub. If you use Subversion or Bitbucket or some other means of Git, you can plug these right in. You just need to have credentials and able to make a connection to them. But for our purposes tonight, we're going to be using the Azure repo that's included with the project. All right. After I select some settings here, right? And actually, I will tell you that when we configure this, you accept the defaults here. We then want to configure a job. Now, I've been calling this pipeline a job, and that's not really the right name for it. It really is a pipeline. And the reason for that is because you can configure multiple jobs to run in one pipeline. Each job has a task, right? And that task you'll define. So in this agent job, now remember you set up here in the pipeline, I said select your agent pool. You can also select your agent pool here. I can say inherit it from the pipeline, or if for some reason I need to change which pool I'm using now, I could pick something different. But for argument's sake, if we set it up here in the pipeline level on-prem, the agent job will just pick up that inherit, right? And you can give your agent job a name here. And what this is going to do is this is going to show in the run log, right? So a lot of times what I'll do is I'll say run, just a brief description, right? Run hello world script. Doesn't need to be anything fancy. And then there's not much else that you have to configure here. There are some choices, but for the most part, we can move on. Now from there, there's this little plus box, and that's how we add a task to our job. Our job is part of a pipeline. So there's a sort of order of operations here. A pipeline has a repo and a job has tasks attached to it. And you can have multiple tasks in a job, or you can have multiple jobs. But to keep it simple, we have this task that we added here. So I added a PowerShell script, right? And this is the name that I gave it. I can call it whatever I want. And in that script, I specified where my code is going to come from. If I'm using the Azure repo, I click this little button here and it gives me my Azure repo scripts. I pick the one I want and I say, okay. I can pass in arguments to my script, which I'm going to show you in a second. And we're going to stop right there. Okay, so now if I've configured all this and I want to run it, I can save it and queue it right here. Okay, but if I've already got pipelines set up, I guess I got to save this because I made some changes. Okay, so here's this hello world script. Look, here's my pipelines. I didn't set up a schedule yet, but if I wanted to run this, I can just right click here and say run pipeline. So let's do this for a second. And I want to go in here. I want to take a look at my repo. Hello world. Okay, so let's do this. Let's do the whole shebang here. So I have done this demo once before. So that's this script right here. Right? Hello world. This is nothing fancy. We got a folder named RTPSUG demo. And we're doing an if here to test if the folder is created, and if not, make directory, right? And if the directory has been created, create a file and then called hello world. So let's see if we can change this. Well, first let's do it once and make sure it runs. I'm gonna go on the machine here. Let's just delete this file. All right, come back to our environment here. Now I want to run this. So there's a breadcrumb path across the top here that I could always use to get back to where I want. So repos and pipelines are parallel. So if I want to get back to my pipelines, I need to go back up to my root here. Or I could have clicked right here, right? Whatever works for you. So if I want to run this job, I'm going to run it. It's going to see if I want to make any temporary changes. I don't. So I'm going to run this. And it's going to take me to a new interface here. And you see here, that line that we put in there before, now it tells me what job is running. Well, it's running the hello world script and says it's queued. So now if I go into this, there's more details. So now I can see here that it initialized a job, it checked it out of Azure DevOps, and now it's running the script. And I'm actually watching an interactive version of that script here. And luckily for me, I got green checks, which means it worked. Okay, so it's going to finalize here. If I go back to my box, I know this wasn't the most exciting script in the world, but this was just created now. Hello world, hello, right? So that was the original demo I ran. So let's go in here, let's see if we can edit this and see if we can break some stuff here. So Cal, PSUG demo, hello world 2. I'm very creative. I'm going to save this. I'm going to be lazy here. I'm going to use the built-in push here to say we want to change this file, change this one file, and change hello world for demo. As you can tell, I'm definitely not a DevOps person. Sysadmin, two-finger typist, lots of typos. So that pushed that out. I'm going to head back over here. We'll take a look. Go to our repo. We got a hello world. We got a hello world 2. Hello from North Carolina. So I was doing this on my machine. My machine is my client workstation, not the build box. Made a change, pushed it up to GitHub. Now have it out here. I want to come back to my pipeline. I'm going to run this. And let's see what happens. Hopefully this will work. Line 4 is okay, just using an alias. VS Code fusses about that. Did I make a mistake in my code here? Let's see. Line 4.
Yeah, Steven's
yeah,
correct.
I did. Yeah. I was sleeping on that one. Okay, it'll pass on that. That failed because someone didn't pay attention in this code. Let's fix that real quick. Let's push that. But you can see it's pretty responsive, right? I can make changes and I'm right back and I can just run my job again. I don't really need to go crazy and worry about it. And you know what? Look, jobs fail. I'd rather them fail in the demo. You guys actually see what happens. And we should actually go back because I kind of went through that a little quick. See if this is going to work. So it checked it out. It's going to try to run that script. If I have a clue what I'm doing. Hey, we got a success. We go in the box. We should have a new directory. SoCal with a file. Woohoo! Really, really powerful stuff there. But let's go back for 1 second, right? And let's go to, and I'm sorry, I didn't ask if the demo, if the screen font was readable. I'm going to go back here. This was that failed job, right? And if I go in here and I look at this exit, I'm going to zoom this in a little bit. I hope that's readable. You could see what happened here. So I can look right at the log and I could see it highlighted here. Well, here's your problem, dummy, right? It says here an item already exists. So the built-in debug that's included without me really configuring anything allows me very quickly to look right away and see where there's a problem. So another feather in the cap for Azure DevOps, right? I can look at my history here and I can kind of get a quick visual here. And I don't know, did I close my email? I closed my email, but I'm getting pinged with success and fails to my email because I have alerting set up. Okay, so how we doing? Does this make sense so far? Because I've been keeping it pretty easy because I don't want to overwhelm people. Any questions? Anything that doesn't make sense or something I really botched on an explanation? All right, great. So let's take this a step further, right? Let's take a look at a job here. Now, let's talk about this one for a second. After I run this, we'll go through, we'll create a job, we could do whatever you guys want. All right. I'm going to go back to my diagram for a second. There's one thing here that I find kind of useful, right? So look, I'm running this here in the cloud. I'm reaching out on-prem. This box is going to then hit this box here. That has the potential to be a problem because this could be a double hop thing. But because this is running here as a service, this is handing it off to here. It's not like authenticating and saying, I got on one and I went to the other. I kind of eliminate that issue. So what's happening is Azure DevOps is checking out the code, taking it, passing it down to the agent on this box. The agent is running it here first time. And then the job that we're going to do is we're going to invoke to another machine, right? So that's going to be the next thing that we do here. Okay, so I have just a start and a stop of a spooler here. And let's take a look at code. Really nothing fancy on this. Start print spooler. Okay, so here's where it gets a little, hello world. I just did like straight PowerShell here, right? Nothing fancy. However, here we're doing things a little different, and I'll tell you why. This service that's running on this box is the network service. Network service is not going to have rights to invoke to another machine. So now we need to authenticate, right? And we're talking about authentication in our local environment. So we're not talking about service principals. We're not talking about anything Azure related. This is all on-prem now, right? And I'm going to do an invoke command. And I always take it for granted, but I've always been an AD admin. Maybe not everybody has a good handle on AD, but domain controllers, not everybody has access to. So in order for me to invoke or connect to a domain controller, I need to have permissions on the domain controller to do that. And let's just take a step back here and say, maybe you're not familiar with invoke command. It's a way to connect to the remote session of another machine securely through PowerShell. So there's two ways you can do that. You can do that. Well, there's a number of different ways, but the most common ways are enter PS session, which would be an interactive command prompt, right? Or invoke command, which is not an interactive command prompt. Invoke command is going to say connect to this machine, run this command on that machine, and use these credentials. And when you finish, return back to your regular command prompt, to your regular PowerShell prompt. Enter PS session would be the same basic command, but instead of here, it would just be this. It would be enter PS session, name of the server I want to connect to, and maybe some credentials. And what would happen is I would have an interactive command prompt on my remote machine. So we're going to do invoke command just because it's a little easier, right? But in order to do this, I need to authenticate. Now, I did a talk last month on secrets management. I haven't updated my lab to take advantage of Azure Key Vaults or anything yet. So I'm doing credentials in a different way, but I'm going to show you a really easy way to do this. So what we've done here is we've built a param block to handle the user ID and a password. Okay, and we're going to pass those into this script, and then we'll talk about that a little bit here. And then once we pass that in, we're going to create a secure string, and then we're going to create a credential object from the user ID and the secure string, and that credential object is going to be what we pass to the invoke command here. All right. So let's talk about that all for a second because I haven't mentioned this yet. Okay. I mentioned earlier something called a library. Okay. If we go into this job, you're going to see something here it's going to look a little different. So here we have the pipeline, name of the job, source, Azure repo, agent job, nothing fancy there. PowerShell script, okay. Script, oh, now we have arguments. Okay, so I want to make it clear to everybody here that this is one way that you could use Azure DevOps. You don't have to do it this way. And I'm sure there's some guys that are doing more DevOps oriented stuff that'll look at this and going, what the hell are you doing? This is a way to pass in credentials. If you don't have a secure vault, you can use your Azure DevOps project as a secure vault. And I'm going to show you that now. So what we're basically doing here is we're saying our script has arguments and we can pass in arguments. We have a user ID param and we have a password param. If we go back here, those are going to correlate to user ID and password, right? And we want to pass variables. We want to pass, we want to pass information into this script so that it can process it, right? We don't want to have to type those in. So the way that we do that, one way that we do that is we use this arguments section here to pass in information. Now this information is going to be pulled from this library section over here. And when we go to the library, you're going to see that you have a couple of different things here, but one of them is called variable groups. And I created a group called credentials. You can call it whatever you want. But when I go into that credentials thing here, you see I can create variables. Now, Azure doesn't give you the ability to store an object, a PS credential here. So I've created one variable for the username, one variable for the password. I can't see the password. It's put in there. And I'm going to be very honest with you. I don't remember what I made the password. But so I have a user ID and a password here. And that's what I'm going to pass in my pipeline. So I'm saying here, go to the arguments section, arguments, pull in from the library, user ID and password. Okay, so there's one other thing here. This library doesn't necessarily relate to this job. And the way that we put a link together to make that happen is right up here in this variables section. So we go to variables here and we say we want to link this. So you don't see it here because I did it already, but I'll show you then. Whoops, that's not what I wanted. There is a way here when there's nothing here. That's not right. Add, no, test. Oh, variable groups. I'm sorry, not pipeline variables. So you see here, I can link a variable group and I'm linking it for this job. So I'm saying here that I have a library of credentials, right? And they could be not credentials. I can make variables for a number of different things. GUIDs, tenant IDs, I don't know, secure string you have to pass in for some other thing. And I can store them here in the project in something called the library. And then when I need to use them, I would go to the pipeline that I'm running. And I would simply link it. So if I go to variable groups here, I would say link the group. And it's going to say I've already linked the credentials group. So there's no other variable groups found. Right. So that's why that's there. When we do a new one, you'll see. So now you see it's pulling in this information from this library section. The cool thing here is that if I go to the library section and I change this, this is a link. So it doesn't have to be manually updated. And once I do this once, I'm done. It's linked to the job and I can just go forward. So now what I'm doing in conceptual here is I am creating a job. The job has a script. The script is in my repo and the script has input, takes input. And the input is going to be variables, credentials that are saved in my project. And I have a way to link those variables in the project to the script. And that all happens without me having to do anything. I just need to know the syntax. And I will tell you that it took me a little while to figure out the correct Azure syntax, but here it is. Parameter, and then the name that you're going to pass in of the variable. And that happens seamlessly. So what this is going to do, we looked at that script earlier. We're basically going to invoke from AZ build 01 to DC 01 and start the service. So let me just make sure that my service is stopped because I've been playing around with this. All right, it's stopped. Okay, so let's go back here for a sec. And I'm sorry if I'm being really obtuse with this stuff. I just want to make sure that it makes sense to everybody because this kind of gets blended together really quickly. So now that we have all this, I'm going to go back to my pipeline here. And I'm going to say, let's start. Let's run this pipeline. Okay, so there's not much to see on here. We'll just watch the job and we'll see what happens here, and then we'll go back and check the service, and this should work. But remember, I'm going from the cloud to my build box, from my build box, invoking to a machine and running code on that second machine and not having any sort of double hop issue here. So this has checked out the code. It's executing the script. Right, you could, and luckily for me, it was successful. And then there's some post here. So you can see right up here, start print spooler. It passed in user ID, service name of the name of this service account, and password. And you notice it doesn't show it there, right? And on our box, DC1, our service is started. So there you go. So just a simple example of some of the stuff you can do. I'll show you something else you can do here. At this point, there's lots of things we could do. I want to just sort of show you some of the things that are possible. So here's a user report. And just to give you an idea here, we got a script called AD user report. And this is going to run a get AD user of a bunch of users in this OU. It's going to export the data to export Excel using the import Excel module from Doug Fink. So how did I do that? Well, that's a good question. Where's it getting export Excel from? So this is going to execute on the AZ build 01 box. So rather than doing anything fancy, I have logged in on this box as the service account, and I just installed the modules on the machine so they're ready to go. I can install them on the fly, doing an import module if I wanted to, but I just pre-did it so I didn't have to waste any time with the build here. And if you're not familiar with Doug Fink's module, Export Excel allows you to make reports, dump the data out to Excel instead of CSV. And I have some simple parameters here that just say auto size the files, the columns, set a title as bold, and do some other stuff here. And we're going to call it user report. And we're just using a little hash table to pass that in. And we're going to only look for last name, first name, same account name, and if the account is enabled. It's nothing super fancy, right? So if we go back over here, we can run this pipeline. Maybe you want to see the config. Let's just take a look at that. There's really nothing exciting in this config. Create user report. I'm running it from Azure repos. All this basic stuff here. AD user report. Now, one thing that I didn't show you yet, and we're going to come back to this when we build a job. You see this icon and you probably assume PowerShell 5, and you'd be right. However, you're not limited to PowerShell 5. When you install, and I'm going to say add a task here, and this is how you would do it. You would add a task, and up here, we're going to go through this in a second. PowerShell. I pick PowerShell. You notice I only have run PowerShell or run PowerShell on target machines, which I did invoke command, but I could have done it differently, right? So this is just PowerShell. Well, hold on a sec. We all know there's a PowerShell 5 and there's PowerShell 7. How do you specify that? Well, down here in this advanced section, you say use PowerShell core. So essentially, Azure DevOps is defaulting to PowerShell 5 unless you decide to use the PowerShell core engine. You check that box and you're off to the races. So I'm going to get this here. I'm going to remove that because I don't want to screw my script up. All right, so I have this here, advanced, running, say, use PowerShell core. Now, obviously, if you're running some commandlets that are PowerShell core specific, like invoke parallel or something like that, that would be important. But for everyday usage, there's probably not a ton of difference between 5 and 7 for simple scripts. But here I'm using PowerShell 7, right? And so if I want to run this now, first let me go over here and I think I still have it in the old folder. All right, so let's just get, that's there. We'll run this. Here's our agent job. And now you can see it's checking it out. PowerShell script, nothing fancy there. So this is running AD user report.ps1. And again, not much to see here. Luckily for me, it's completed. And I have gone ahead and installed Excel on this box just to show you. But the the import Excel module doesn't require Excel to be on the box to create Excel reports, which is pretty cool. So if this was my build box and I didn't have Excel on here, I wouldn't be able to open the file, but I can produce the file and then I can copy it off, or if it's a share or something like that, pull it from another machine. But if I open this up here, you see I created a user report. Whoa, what the heck happened there? Well, that's not good. Let's take these params off. Anybody have any questions while I'm waiting for this guy to sync up here? All right, so while we're doing that, we're going to go back here. Pipelines, we'll just rerun this. Whoops. Run pipeline. I gotta go in here and just run this guy and we will wait. So you can see here it executed with PowerShell 7. It's completed. And who knows, maybe we'll get a working report this time. Ugh. I'm being fancy with stuff. I should have just kept it simple. Oh. Idiot. I'll push that up, but I don't think we need to wait for that one again. All right, so that's just a basic idea of some of the things that you can do with Azure DevOps running on-prem stuff. Of course, we could run stuff in the cloud as well. You need to have some service account. You need to have a service principal to reach out to Azure. You need to be able to run with Azure Cloud Shell, or you probably want to pull down a module and do the things, but you get the basic idea. It's pretty much the same, right? So let's go back. Let's take a look at the interface. I don't need this anymore. All right. And let's see, let's create a pipeline. All right, so I broke my multi-step job here, but I just want to give you an example of what a multi-step job looks like, right? So, and I actually deleted it here so we can do it again. So I just called this multi-step job, pull it in from Azure, right? Start. So here we go. The first one that says stop. I want to make a second one. Over here, I'm going to go PowerShell, and I'm going to go through this from scratch and probably make a little bit more sense in 1 second here. I'm going to select the script, and this time I'm going to say sleep. And then I want to do a third step. And I want to say start. And for each one of these, I would need to put in credentials if it needs it. Sleep shouldn't need that. That goes there. And then for each one of these, I can set if I wanted to be PowerShell or and there you go. I would save this and I would queue it. Now, I'm not going to run this because if you got on the call early before we started the demo, I was explaining that one of these scripts I corrupted. So I know it's not going to work and I'm not going to waste your time while I try to fix that. But this is how you can create a job that has multiple tasks in it. And you see here, there's no limit. I can go on as long as I want. This will just run and go through order. And oh, that's probably why I didn't link my variable group. Okay. Let's give it a shot. So here you see it's going to do multiple things. If I gave unique names to each one of these, I would know when things are happening. I didn't name them very well, so you can't really understand what's happening here. But the first one is run the stop script. Now it completed that one. It's running the sleep script, which was just start sleep 15 seconds. And you see there's a running total here, 35 seconds execute this job, 20 seconds on this level. It completed that. And what do you know? When you actually link the variables to the job actually completes. So that's a nice little surprise. And then here it is, it's going and it's starting. This is, last one was starting this principal, or again, if you want, we could do it again and I could show you the service stopped and started, but we got green checks, we know that it ran. And that's how you run a multi-step job, right? So let's start from the beginning and let's configure a pipeline from scratch and try and let's do something on our own here, right? So at this point, I don't have a ton extra to demo to you guys. I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have because I feel like maybe I didn't cover everything that is needed for you to understand this.
There are a couple in chat for sure.
Cool. Let's see here. Can you quickly show you how I pointed VS Code to the Azure repo? I missed it. Sure, William, I'd be happy to do that. So let's go back to the repo, okay? And when you get into the repo, now I've already provisioned a repo, okay? If I go to repos, new repository right there, right? So if I want to make a new repository, I would give it a name. We'll call it test repo, right? I don't care about a README for this. Now I have a new repo and it gives me the syntax here, right? But and I would just copy this if I want, or if I have the repo already, switch back. If you've already instantiated and that window is gone, you hit the clone button up here and it'll give you syntax here and a convenient copy of the clipboard, right? So nothing too fancy here, right? So what I'm going to do, if you're not familiar with this, is I would, let's go back to the other one for a second. Test repo. I copy this. I'm going to come down to my client workstation. I'm at my Git level. So just so we're all clear, I have a bunch of repos and they're all sitting parallel to each other. Here, scripts, Git repos, and then they're all sitting here. So what I'm doing is I'm at the Git repos folder and I'm just going to say git clone there. I cloned an empty repo. Well, that's fine. So now I have, what do we call it? Test repo, and we'll say new. Of course, it's going to be difficult. I don't care. Of course, come on. Okay. Just use Notepad for a second here. Oh, I'm in test repo already. Good. Commit M dummy files. Push. And there's my test file. So to do that is just use that clone functionality. Copy that and you go back to your Git directory and then you should be off to the races. All right, so let me just go back to the chat here. Got to run, great presentation, thanks. Can steps be dependent on other steps? For example, if you had a script to grab some data from a database and dump it to a file, and a second script, SFTP somewhere, if that first step failed, could that not be a terminator? Yeah, so you obviously can get a lot more detailed than what I've been doing. So the other thing that we really don't cover here is like if I run a job and job one has some output and I need to save that output and I need to pass it to job two, how do I do that? And that gets a little bit more challenging. And that's where you're going to start to hit the limits of the config that I've showed you here. That's where artifacts and stuff like that probably become a little bit more useful, but you absolutely can do the things like that. And maybe we should show a little something like that. So if we go here, we go to pipelines. What I didn't do was create a new pipeline from the beginning, because this is actually a little confusing. So I apologize. Maybe I should have started here. Okay, so if I want to make a pipeline, I find this interface not so intuitive, and I'll tell you why. Because the first thing you're going to do here is like, oh yeah, Mike said it's in my Azure repo. Okay, let's do that. Oh, it's in the demops. Yeah, well, hold on. This does not look like what I want, right? So if we go back here, right, and we say, well, what do I do here? Well, right down here, not so easy to see, use the classic editor for a pipeline without YAML. Now, I will say this, Azure DevOps is absolutely about infrastructure as code and all that good stuff. So you definitely want to learn YAML. You definitely want to learn how to do these commands and configurations from the command line, but it is not easy. So what a lot of people will do, and I'm going to back out of this for a second here, is they will create their pipeline like I did here in the GUI. They'll go to edit and they'll come right up here and they'll say, where's the button? View YAML, right? And then they'll use that as their starter to go and create a YAML file. So if they're not familiar with the syntax, they can see a working file already. So they copy it to the clipboard, right? Like I just did. Then you'll go back to your command editor. You'll start by making a file, maybe change some parameters, push it up. You see here PowerShell, right? It gets, come on. See, I have versions. It has versions up here. So you got to kind of know your way around this a little bit, right? If I go, let's go look at that multi-step. You're a dummy. Love that. So there's YAML for each one of these here, and we'll have to figure out how to link it together. That's the reason I stayed to the GUI, because I just think that the YAML is just way too hard to start with. And I know I went a little bit off topic here. I'll go back to what I wanted to talk about, which was if I want to create a new pipeline, right? And I was talking about this interface, everything you see here is going to be YAML based. That's why it doesn't look like anything you've seen to date. So if you go back here, the way to get around that is to use the classic editor. And when you use the classic editor, you'll now get a wizard and you say, well, where's my data? Okay, I want to use Azure repos. I say continue. And then it says, well, oh, configuration is code featured. What do I want to use here? Whoa, there's a lot here. I don't see any PowerShell. Wait, what do I do? That's because we want to start with an empty job. So when you say empty job, you will get what you just saw that I've been showing. And then we can go in and we can pick the stuff. So first step, use the classic editor. Second, pick your repo. Third step, empty job, and you'll get everything that I've been demoing tonight. So now what we got is a pipeline. It gave it a name. I can change it. And notice it defaulted to Azure Pipelines. So I want to switch to on-prem. Here's my agent job. And now I want to add a task. And when I add a task, remember I said that there's quite a bit of languages here that this supports. I'll just scroll for a little bit here, right? And you see if there's anything here. I mean, it's just amazing, the list here, right? If I say Rust, F sharp, maybe it doesn't have that. Java, Azure Functions, all kinds of stuff. But for our purposes, we want to see PowerShell, right? So when we do that, here's our choices, right? And if you want to run on-prem, you just say this guy here. And now we're really right back to where we were before. So let's run something, right? We can say, hello world. Oh, let's do set company info. I didn't do that one yet, right? I can pass in some arguments. This is my use service account that I want to run it as. And I'm cheating here a little bit. I made my service account a domain admin so I could make changes to the script. If I want to specify that it runs PowerShell core. Now, some other stuff here. I have environment variables I can add. I have Output variables, I don't use any of these. I have what was I looking for? Preference variables. Okay, I can set my error action. I can set a warning preference information. All the stuff that you know as PowerShell is here. You just have to find it in the interface. You can change where it works. You can change scopes. There's so many options that are here. But if you remember way back in the beginning, I said, well, somewhere in here, I said, let's dumb it down and keep it simple, right? And that's why I said that, is because you could get lost in the options. Okay. Can you quickly show point of VS Code, line 4 is okay. Any other questions that we want to cover? And I can keep going through here and we can break in a few minutes if nobody has any further questions. All right, so going back here, so I can configure a job. I configure this to run set company info to show you set company info. It's a simple AD thing that's going to set param on a user. Really fancy stuff here. Okay, so if I come back over to my job here, so I'm saying set company info, pass in some variables, and I should be ready to go here. I can go right from here and I could say save in queue, or I can save it. Now, we did not talk about triggers. Triggers is how you schedule jobs. So if I want to schedule a job here, I can do it by build completion, or I can do it through time. Now, this is the one area that I will say that the GUI interface is lacking. And when I say that is because you can only schedule stuff here hourly and minutes for a day. And you can pick your time zone. You can pick your days. But what you don't see here is I want to run this on once a month, right? You only have a weekly schedule here. In YAML, you can do that much more with much more granularity. YAML is going to use the cron syntax. So whatever syntax, whatever variations you can do with cron, and I know that you can do monthly or quarterly or yearly jobs. That's all available through YAML. You do have some limitations here. Now, there is some other limitations. If I want to run this job, so right now this is going to run at hour 1, which would be 1 a.m. UTC, or if I want to run in a different time zone for you guys, Pacific, that's 1 a.m. on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. What if I want to run it at Monday, 1 o'clock and 4 o'clock? I need to add another schedule, and I change that to 4. And that's how I schedule my work. You can also do it by build completion, right? You can set up some build that triggers. If something happens, then do this. That's a little bit alluding to what Stephen was just asking about. So if this build if this script completes, then do this. So you have that option as well. I don't usually work that way. We usually do timed runs. And you can include all kinds of fancy stuff here, but that's how you schedule a job, right? So even if I schedule a job, if I go here, I think I can see the schedule. No, I can't. I can still run this. Oh, remember I said this is the recently run. So we created a new pipeline. Oh, I didn't name it. So let's go back and fix that. Doesn't show in my recently run because we haven't run it yet. So I go here and I say demo new job, and I can, even though I have a schedule, I can run it on demand. And now we have that new job that we started. It's going to check it out and run. And here's a bunch of stuff going by that's not necessarily pertinent to us right now. But remember, it's 11:15 my time. It's 8:15 you guys' time. At 1 o'clock in the morning, that job is going to kick off, and this failed because I didn't link the variables to it again. That's why. So to fix that, edit.
This is basically how every pipeline build goes. You just
Exactly.
do it one step at a time until you get a green checkbox.
Yes, and I would agree with that 100%. You know, the MVP title that I have, I think some people assume that you're like some scripting god and you can do anything. No, same exact thing, right? You build it and you get it to work a little bit at a time. So,
as long as you squash your commits at the end, everything's okay.
which I never do anyway, but I can't even get the guys on my team to make good commit messages, so it doesn't matter. But yes, but you see how Matt really just hit the nail on the head there, which is you build it up. And we could have jumped in here and we could have started with YAML and doing a whole bunch of infrastructure as code, but you know what? You're not going to start that way. Nobody is. And it's just not an interface that's conducive with all the options to just jump in and go right to the command line. And I feel like showing this off to people for a new technology to get your feet wet with, going to the command line probably is not the way to start. So you see that job ran, it's just because I didn't have credentials linked to it. But there's a lot of options, and you really can take this as far as you want. Now, let me just give you some real world experience. My company is using this, and we have probably about 15 or 18 jobs that are run on a regular basis. And we're a directory services group, so it's a lot of like AD maintenance, group management, backups, moving stuff around in the Azure cloud, moving people between group memberships. We have, like I said, 18 to 20 jobs. We have jobs that run hourly. We have just one pipeline we're using right now. Things queue up, things wait, and they run when they run. We've run over 6,000 runs, and it's been flawless. And I think maybe once or twice there was an outage with Azure where some of our scripts didn't run. But honestly, I don't have to worry about it every month. Windows patches coming down, is my box up, any of that crap. I just go in, I configure my jobs, they run essentially when I ask them to run. I get failures if they don't run. And that's kind of it. It just works. Now, I will give you a tip. What we found is we're not super DevOps organization, right? It's 5 guys who work. We have some level of scripting knowledge, but our Git foo is not exactly strong. So what we have done is we made 2 projects, basically prod and test. And in prod, we have all our jobs scheduled to run. And in test, we basically have the same code in a separate repo, but it's play code, right? Nothing is scheduled to run on automation. And the reason we did that is for the prod stuff, we wanted to know about every time there was an issue. So we have all the alerting turned on for the prod repo. But the problem is if you start building jobs in the prod repo and you're testing out like I was just doing, well, 4 of the people on my team are getting like 17 failures while I try to figure out how to make my pipeline work. So we run it in test and we shut off all the alerting in test so that you can pound away on your jobs and not have to worry about blowing up the email queue of your teammates. And then when you get it all figured out and it's working the way you want, we just basically move that code over to the production repo and recreate the job. And that way it pretty much eliminates the error, the trial and error that we were doing like I was doing before. So that's just one way we've gotten around it. And that's simply because the requirement for us to know when jobs fail. So we turned on a lot of alerting in our product queue. That is pretty much all the information I wanted to share tonight. It was just a touch. There's a lot more that you could do with Azure DevOps than what I showed tonight. And obviously there's a whole section about doing stuff in the cloud or working from a DevOps sort of functionality with test builds and artifacts, right? I didn't touch any of that. This is really Azure DevOps for the sysadmin who's going to try to run something on-prem. But I will tell you that my organization has zero cost to use Azure DevOps right now. We're running with 5 users. We have 1 pipeline. We have a bunch of repos, but we don't have any costs coming from this. And then we've been using it for about a year, and we're not afraid to spend money. We just haven't had the need. We're going to add a pipeline in the near future. I just have to get around to configuring it. But we've been able to do 6,000 runs with 1 pipeline, letting some jobs queue up, and they all work themselves out. 5 users and a number of jobs, and we've had zero to little cost from Azure DevOps, and it's been a fantastic success for us. We have nothing to manage on-prem. There's no more Windows task scheduler to deal with. There's no more OS issues to deal with. There's no more Windows patch updates to deal with. If I want to increase my capacity, I just click a few buttons in the product and it handles the work for me. I don't need to spin up another box. I don't need to think about any of that. And that's why I was saying in the beginning that I really do think that Azure DevOps is a fantastic solution for running not only automation in the cloud, but working on-prem. You can essentially run this for free, even if you have to spend some cost. You saw when we ran the calculator, 10 users, a little bit of space, an extra pipeline, you're still coming in at less than $1,000 a year, which is probably cheaper than the licensing on any of those third-party products, unless you're using an open source version that's free. And if it's free, you're going to be on your own. Now, remember, this is a paid product. Paid essentially can be zero, but it's a supported product. That means you do get to submit support cases to Azure support if you have problems and you need help. So I really struggle to find a reason not to use this tool. I know that people have their favorites, but I've really come to appreciate this tool. And I think if you give it a shot, you might like it as well. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to cover them. But I hope that was a pretty good demo of what Azure DevOps is. And hopefully with the recording and some notes, you can probably follow along and get up to speed in about an hour or two's time and have this running in your environment. There's really not a lot of gotchas once you get that agent installed. After that, it's really pretty straightforward if you can get your comfort level with the interface. So with that, maybe we'll finish up here, and I will be happy to stick around for questions. If not, I'll say goodnight and thank you for the time, and it was fun. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, that was awesome. Thanks so much, Mike. And like you said, if there's any questions, feel free to shout them out or type them in chat. We're here to answer them.
So I always have a tough time. I'm glad people ask some questions in the chat. Hard to get an idea if you put people to sleep or not, but I'm glad people got some feel for the product. Most of my demos, I kind of do the same way. I try not to go with like the super deep advanced stuff because I feel like that's not what most people are doing. I like to keep it to the simple stuff and hopefully light a fire in someone to maybe come back to work and want to use it. So I hope it was worthwhile, but it's always hard on the presenter side to get a good feel for what everybody thought. But thanks for the feedback in the chat, everyone. I do appreciate it.
No, I agree. This whole topic of CI/CD pipelines, really, regardless of whatever tool you use, right? Like if your company is not using Azure DevOps, if they're using GitLab or something like that, that is really your entryway into understanding like how modern software gets built and deployed. This is the way, at least for now. You know, until whatever the next big thing is, this is the way everybody's doing it.
Yeah, and I think that like Now I have to do the deep dive. Well, I have to figure out how to do the deep dive before I do it, Diego, but I'd be happy to try. But, you know, my path is coming from traditional admin and coming to this cloud world. There are guys that are younger than me who come out of school and they don't have to build any servers. Everything is cloud deploy, and they start with a DevOps mentality and they can pick it up much faster. But switching from the people that work on-prem and try to work in this cloud first world, it is a challenge, you know? So that's why I was kind of alluding to the fact, like, just turn on the stuff you need. I mean, you can turn on the other stuff later when you get more comfortable, but man, it's so overwhelming when you have 1,000 options in the display and you're like, what do I do? So I try to dumb it down as much as I can and get started, and then baby steps up from there, just like Matt was saying. You know, you can always move on to bigger and better.
So William Lee asked a good question. So if you have a task failure, and Mike, correct me if I'm wrong, but there are in any of these products, there should be a way to configure tasks to either continue on failure or fail on failure, right? So you can say, like, if there's a specific task that's not critical to the success of that pipeline, be it a reporting task or something like that that you don't necessarily care about succeeding every single time, you can configure that specific task to fail and the rest of your pipeline to continue forward.
Yeah. Now, so this is a double-edged sword here because this is PowerShell that we're talking about, right? So you have two ways that you can look at this. You can configure jobs and have the jobs to do things like, oh, come on, I did it again. I want it. Fail on error, right? Or error action preference, stop. What I usually do is I usually will set this stuff to silently continue, and I'll have logging in my PowerShell script, and I'll let the logging figure out what happened, but I want the job to continue. Now, maybe in this particular task here, if the first one doesn't run, it should just stop, right? But you do have to make a choice between, because PowerShell has some ability in the code itself to do error action preferences. So do I want the job pipeline to do that, or do I want my scripts that are running that the job pipeline is going to execute? But Matt's 100% right. You have the choices here to pick where you want to do that. I usually step away from this and stick with the code because that's kind of what I know, right? And I'll do my error action preference maybe in the code, and I'll just have the jobs always run, partially because don't forget, a stop may generate an error, right? So, and an error may generate an alert. That's what I wanted to say. And sometimes if an alert goes to my team and they're like, oh, the job didn't run, well, maybe the job didn't run just because something timed out that's not important to the job. So I want it to keep running. I'm kind of going a long about way here to say that you have a choice. You can do it in the job engine, or if you're doing it in code that's robust enough to handle that, you can let the job action silently continue and then pick that up in your scripts. But Matt was right on. Multi-step jobs have options. Do you want to keep continuing? And also remember, when we had this other thing here, if I add another task to this, task, PowerShell, come on, PowerShell, add, if I go here, script path, pick a thing, okay. Oh, Jesus Christ, where was that option to have? Oh, triggers, right? Build completion, right? So I did a multi-step job here, but one option I could have done was to have these as 3 pipelines, schedule them out so that the trigger is on build completion of the previous job. So script 1 finishes, trigger script 2. Script 2 finishes, trigger script 3. This comes down to the problem that all the best tools have, which is when you get a lot of choices, there's more than one way to solve a problem. And the one that works best is what you understand, not necessarily what everybody does. So just sitting here in 5 minutes, I've come up with 3 different ways: the job engine error action preference, the script error action preference, or build completion, right? And I'm sure there's more if I think about it. So there's a lot of choices here. You have to figure out which works best for you. William, I'll also just add on here that in my scripts, I didn't build any logging, right? So really, logging should be paramount to the script because that's going to probably tell you more than the job output to kind of give you an idea of what's going on. There is some pretty good stuff here to see what happened. But the other thing is, do you want to have to come in to this interface every time you want to see what happened? Logs dumped to a directory are easy to gather with your PowerShell command prompt or browse to and use an editor to read. So there's that, right? But logging really helps a lot, especially most people are not going to be running one-line scripts like I did tonight. We have a job that we use to sync between Workday and Active Directory because we don't have the Workday agent available in the cloud yet. So we have to do a manual sync of 25,000 user accounts. What changed in Workday? There's like 20 different parameters. Check that, see if it's an updated in Active Directory, and if it isn't updated, update that. Well, we have a script with a lot of heavy logging to see when things break down rather than just the job failed. So I would really push for some logging as well. What else can I help people with? If you made it this far, and how many people we have left here? 13, so we did all right. I would like to say, where is it? Oh, if you really love PowerShell, why don't you come and join me in about 18 hours for an Ignite session called Ask the Experts. I'm very privileged, very flattered to be in this group of people, but it's a Q&A session. It's 30 minutes at Ignite tomorrow. It's going to be the PowerShell team, myself, Justin Grote, excuse me, Mr. Jeff Hicks, and Mr. Jeffrey Snover. And I'm super privileged, feel privileged to be a part of this group. I'll probably sit there and won't say much, but come on down and hang out with us. It's going to be 30 minutes open to ask any questions that you like. Following this, outside of Ignite, we're going to do a sort of like after party thing where there's no time limit and we can hang out. So if you're interested, sign up through Ignite. It's going to be a Teams event, Teams live event. I know there's over 300 people signed up already. Love to have you there tomorrow. It would be a great honor if you can come and join me. And the last plug I'll give is for my user group. My user group has a meeting tomorrow night at the same time, or right after this finishes. And we're going to be talking about how a sysadmin took some non-traditional work and automated it with PowerShell. Things like setting ACLs and doing a lot of stuff like that. And it's his journey from coming into an organization and getting handed a task that someone was doing by hand. And he said, I don't think I want to do this by hand. And he was able to cut the run times down on the job from about 65%, if I remember correctly. So that's tomorrow night with my group if you'd like to join us as well.
All right. With that, thank you very much, Mike. As always,
Sure.
very appreciated for you to stop by, especially since it's so much later over there.
No problem. No problem at all. Glad to do it.
All right, everybody. Well, after this, I'm going to send out the recording, and then I will also include, Mike, if you have a link to a repo or something that you used tonight that I could include,
Yeah, I do.
you can shoot that over to me on Twitter and I'll get that out with the video as well. But
Well,
other than that,
before you hit end on this, let me share, just because since you just asked about that. GitHub CompWiz 32 presentations, and in there is, I'll send the link to you, Matt, but 2111, and here's the files, and then I'll make available my repo that I used for the demo that has the scripts, although the scripts are nothing to write home about, but be happy to share that as well. And then someone asked for a link for the session. I'll throw this in the chat real quick. It's tomorrow, 6:30 p.m. Eastern, 3:30 p.m. Pacific. The session name or the session ID is in the chat. It's not the easiest to search for, but it's tomorrow late afternoon. And that's everything. I'll send you the links though.
cool.